I want to ask you again about the op-ed, the article you wrote for the New York Times, describing what it was like, in the deployment in 2014 in Gaza. You wrote, that some of your soldiers were feeling doubts at that time. And then you wrote your own thoughts on a piece of paper. And you wrote this. I wrote that some members of my team had been tallying the number of soldiers killed and discussing whether this operation was worth the losses. I think it could be worth it, I wrote, as long as we decisively eliminate the threat. That's the lie they told us, and the lie that's being repeated today, that we can decisively eliminate the threat of Hamas through a military operation. Bensi, how did you come to the conclusion that you couldn't?
Well, one of the voices that I've listened to over the years and I've been convinced by is not just the voices of human rights activists, but also the voice of the former head of the Shin Bet, Ami Ayalon, who's the top counterterrorism expert and for 4.5 years in the country. And he said this openly. He said the only way to decisively defeat the terrorism that Hamas represents is through creating an alternative and creating hope. And that means working towards a political solution. And our current government has been fundamentally committed to opposing a political solution and to preventing the creation of a Palestinian state and preventing Palestinian independence. So therefore, that's why I realized that a military alone will not defeat Hamas. And that's why I think that our government needs to be changed immediately.
So let me ask you then as well, because you talk a lot in your op-ed about what you saw in Gaza in 2014. Tell me, because earlier you said you don't believe that the soldiers distinguish carefully enough between civilians and Hamas fighters. What did you yourself experience to make you say that?
Well, in the area that we went, we were told that all the civilians had fled, and that was true for the most part, but it wasn't entirely true. We did find civilians. There was an entire family in the second neighborhood that my unit took over. There was an entire family who stayed behind, and the soldiers, luckily, when they entered the house, they didn't kill them through live fire. They gave them food and water. They guarded them for many days. But when we pulled out, the Air Force flew overhead and bombed the entire neighborhood, and 8 members of that family were killed. I learned this later. So I've seen this with my own eyes, and I'm listening today. I'm listening to my own leaders, including who I mentioned, Bezalel Smotrich, who said he doesn't really differentiate between the Palestinian Authority, which recognizes Israel and wants to negotiate with Israel, and Hamas. The Arabs are the Arabs. That's what he said on Saturday night on Israeli television. So it's hard for me to believe. I don't believe it. I've seen it with my own eyes. I don't believe that Israel is doing everything in its power to prevent civilian casualties based on the statements of members of the Likud and other members of the coalition. And I think that that's a result of the fact that this government doesn't view the Palestinian people as the future partners for making peace with. And they are just convinced that overwhelming military power is going to bring us safety and security. And this is a catastrophic mistake. It's the same catastrophic mistake that led us to the horrific events of October 7th. And we absolutely need to change that. We need our partners abroad. We need the US government. Also, I'm an Israeli, but I'm also an American. And I expect that the American government also not just pays lip service to the idea of pursuing a political solution. Settlements are expanding at an incredible rate. Settlers are illegally taking over land, not even according to international law, according to Israeli law. They're going out and they're shooting at Palestinian civilians, and there's no, with impunity, there's no real enforcement against them. And so I think our international partners and allies need to take a stance on the side of the Israelis who are demanding a political solution and are demanding differentiation, and that our government makes sure not to harm and kill innocent civilians.
Bensi, obviously they tell us endlessly that they are doing their best, but you can see allies like the United States are getting increasingly worried, not to mention everybody on the ground, about the civilian toll. There are stories, a lot, about dissent being quashed in Israel. Are you not worried about what you're saying to me publicly now being accused of siding with the enemy and the kind of things that are getting some Israelis in trouble?
You know, it's a risk that I have to take for the future of the people of Israel. Siding with the enemy would be ironic for my government to accuse me after my government, in order to prevent a Palestinian state, actually facilitated the transfer of hundreds of millions of dollars to Hamas, and preferred to bolster Hamas and to delegitimize the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian human rights organizations. They designated Palestinian human rights organizations as terrorist organizations. They categorized Palestinian diplomatic initiatives as as diplomatic terrorism. But Hamas, they facilitated the transfer of hundreds of millions of dollars. And they also crushed Palestinian hopes of independence, which also fed the fuel of Hamas.